Jake Morrison pressed his face against the cold glass of the observation deck and watched his son, Danny, play with the other kids in the recreation area below. The 8-year-old boy was laughing as he chased his new friend Katie around the plastic jungle gym that had been built into the center of the large room. 3,000 people lived on this ship called New Haven, and most of them were families like Jake and Danny, who were heading to start a new life on Eden Prime. The journey would take 6 more weeks, but Jake did not mind. He had spent the last 2 years planning this move after his wife died in the accident. Danny needed a fresh start somewhere far from the memories of Earth, and Jake needed work that would let him spend more time with his son. The colony worlds always needed engineers, and Jake was good with his hands. He could build anything and fix anything that broke. Danny spotted his father watching from above and waved with both hands. Jake waved back and smiled. The boy had been sad for so long after losing his mother, but the excitement of space travel and making new friends had brought back his laugh. Jake had not heard that sound in months, and it made his heart feel lighter. A loud alarm started ringing through the ship. The lights in the corridor turned red, and Jake felt his stomach drop. He had served in the military before Danny was born, and he knew that sound. It meant danger was coming. The voice of Captain Bell came over the speakers. All passengers must return to their rooms immediately. This is not a drill. Security teams report to stations. All passengers must return to their rooms immediately. Jake ran toward the stairs that led down to the recreation area. He had to get to Danny before whatever was happening got worse. Other parents were doing the same thing, and the stairs became crowded with people pushing and shoving. A woman fell down, and Jake helped her up, but kept moving toward his son. The ship shook hard. Jake grabbed the railing to keep from falling. The lights went out for a few seconds, then came back on dimmer than before. Someone was shooting at them. Jake reached the recreation area and saw the children huddled together in the center, while 2 security guards stood by the doors with their weapons ready. Danny saw his father and ran toward him. Jake caught the boy in his arms and held him tight. The other parents were doing the same thing with their kids, and everyone was asking questions that nobody could answer. The ship shook again, and this time, the lights stayed off longer. When they came back on, Jake could see strange shadows moving outside the windows. Ships that looked nothing like human ships were flying around New Haven. They were long and thin like snakes, with dark metal that seemed to eat the light from the eye. Stars. Jake had seen ships like these in military reports. Zephyrians. The reptile aliens had been attacking human settlements for months, but always on the frontier worlds, where there were no witnesses. Nobody knew why they were doing it, but the attacks were getting more frequent and more bold. The doors to the recreation area exploded inward, and creatures in dark armor came through the smoke. They were tall as basketball players, but thin like sticks with long arms that ended in clawed hands. Their heads were shaped like triangles, and their eyes glowed yellow behind their helmets. Jake counted 6 of them moving with the smooth grace of hunters. The security guards opened fire, but their bullets bounced off the alien armor like raindrops. The Zephyrians raised weapons that looked like silver tubes, and blue light shot out. The guards fell down and did not move, but Jake could see they were still breathing. Jake pushed Danny behind him and looked around for another way out, but the aliens had already surrounded all the families. One of the creatures made a sound like clicking, and the others spread out around the room. They were looking at the children and pointing at some of them, but not others. The lead alien walked up to a family near Jake and looked down at their daughter, who was maybe 10 years old. It made another clicking sound, and 2 other aliens grabbed the girl by her arms. Her parents tried to fight, but the blue light hit them, and they collapsed, just like the guards. Jake realized what was happening. They were taking the children. Not all of them, but only the ones that were a certain age. Danny was 8 years old, and Jake could see one of the aliens looking right at his son. Time slowed down as Jake made his choice. He pushed Danny toward the back wall and charged at the nearest alien. His hands closed around the creature's weapon, and for a moment they struggled for control. The alien was stronger, but Jake was desperate, and fear made him fight harder than he had ever fought in his life. The weapon fired, and blue light hit the ceiling. Pieces of metal fell down around them as Jake tried to turn the weapon toward the other aliens. But there were too many of them, and they were too fast. Clawed hands grabbed him from behind and lifted him off his feet. Jake watched in horror as two Zephyrians walked toward Danny, who was pressed against the wall with tears running down his face. The boy called out for his father, but Jake could not reach him. The blue light hit Jake in the chest, and darkness took him away. Jake woke up on the floor of the recreation area, with his head pounding like someone had hit him with a hammer. The room was quiet except for the sound of people crying and the low hum of the ship's engines. He sat up slowly and looked around at the other families who were starting to wake up from the alien weapons. Danny was gone. Jake knew this before he even finished looking around the room, but he searched anyway. He crawled on his hands and knees, checking behind every piece of playground equipment and calling his son's name. Other parents were doing the same thing, and their voices echoed off the walls in a sound that was worse than the alarm had been. Captain Bell's voice came over the speakers again, but this time she sounded tired and broken. The alien ships had left and taken 47 children with them. Search teams were checking every part of New Haven, but Jake already knew they would find nothing. The Zephyrians were gone, and they had taken Danny with them. The next few hours passed like a bad dream. Medical teams checked everyone who had been hit by the blue light, but found no serious injuries. Security officers asked questions that nobody could answer. Where did the aliens come from? Why did they only take some children? What were they planning to do with the kids they took? Jake sat in his small room and stared at Danny's empty bed. The boy's stuffed elephant lay on the pillow where he had left it that morning. Jake picked up the toy and held it against his chest, while he tried to think of what to do next. The ship was still heading toward Eden Prime, but Jake no longer cared about starting a new life there. 2 days later, a Colonial Defense Force ship called the Defender met up with New Haven. Captain Lisa Chun came aboard with a team of officers who specialized in alien attacks. She was a small woman with gray hair and tired eyes who had seen too many scenes like this one. Jake waited in line with the other parents to talk to Captain Chun. When his turn came, she looked at his file on her tablet and shook her head. Danny, Morrison age 8, taken during Raid 7 of this series. She looked up at Jake with the expression of someone who had to give bad news too. Many times, the Zephyrians had hit 7 human ships in the past 2 months and taken over 300 children total. The aliens always targeted kids between 6 and 12 years old, and they always escaped into the Void Nebula where human ships could not follow. The nebula was filled with energy storms and gravitational fields that would tear apart any vessel that tried to enter without the right navigation equipment. Captain Chun explained that rescue missions had been tried, but none had succeeded. 2. Full battle groups had been lost in the nebula with all hands. The colonial government was working on new technology that might let them track the alien ships, but it would take years to develop. Jake asked how long the children could survive in alien hands. Captain Chun looked at her tablet again and did not meet his eyes. Intelligence suggested the Zephyrians were conducting some kind of research, but the details were classified. When Jake pressed for more information, she told him that families were being offered counseling services and financial support to help them rebuild their lives. Jake left the meeting room and walked back to his quarters, where he packed Danny's clothes into a small bag. He would not be rebuilding anything. He would be getting his son back. The ship reached Eden Prime 3 weeks later, but Jake did not get off with the other colonists. Instead, he took a transport back toward the inner worlds, where he could find what he needed. The credits he had saved for starting a new life would be spent on something else entirely. Jake's first stop was a space station called Haven's Rest that existed in the gray area between legal commerce and outright piracy. The station was built inside a hollowed-out asteroid, and it smelled like oil and unwashed bodies. This was where people came when they needed things that the colonial government would not sell them. A weapons dealer named Nick Santos looked at Jake's credit balance and smiled. Santos was a thin man with scars on his hands and the kind of eyes that had seen people die. He showed Jake through a warehouse filled with guns and explosives from a dozen different worlds. Jake bought everything he thought he might need: plasma, rifles that could cut through ship hulls, explosives that could crack open asteroid bases, body armor that would stop most small arms fire. Santos threw in a military-grade scanner that could detect Zephyrian technology signatures. Next, Jake found a shipyard where they asked no questions about what modifications a customer wanted. He traded his small passenger transport for a beaten-up freighter called the Second Chance and paid extra to have it rebuilt from the inside out. The shipyard workers installed military-grade shields and weapon systems that should have required government permits. The hardest thing to find was information about the Void Nebula and the Zephyrian bases hidden inside it. Jake spent weeks in bars and trading posts buying drinks for smugglers and pirates who might have heard something useful. Most of them just wanted his money, but a few had real intelligence to sell. An old freighter captain named Pete Williams claimed he had been captured by Zephyrians 5 years ago and escaped from one of their research stations. Williams was drunk most of the time, and his stories changed depending on how much he had been drinking, but some of the details stayed the same. The aliens were interested in human brain chemistry, and they ran experiments on their prisoners to understand how human minds worked. Jake bought Williams enough alcohol to keep him talking for 3 days and recorded everything the old captain said. Most of it was probably lies, but somewhere in the rambling stories there might be information that would help him find Danny. 6 months after the attack on New Haven, Jake looked at himself in the mirror of his ship and saw a stranger looking back. He had lost weight, and his eyes had the same tired look as Captain Sean's. His hands were steady, and his mind was clear, but something inside him had changed. The man who had waved at his son through the observation deck window was gone, and someone else had taken his place. Jake started the engines of his rebuilt ship and set course for the Void Nebula. He had spent every credit he owned and burned every bridge that led back to his old life. There was only one thing left in the universe that mattered to him, and he was going to get it back, no matter what the cost turned out to be. The edge of the Void Nebula looked like a wall of purple and black clouds that stretched across space as far as Jake's sensors could detect. Lightning, the size of continents, danced between the gas formations, and gravity readings showed massive objects moving through the darkness. Jake had read every report about the nebula that he could find, and all of them said the same thing. Ships that went in did not come out. Jake checked his weapons one more time and started flying toward the wall of clouds. His ship's computer immediately started screaming warnings about radiation levels and gravitational anomalies, but Jake had disabled most of the safety systems months ago. The Second Chance shook as it entered the nebula, and the lights flickered. But the upgraded shields held. Flying through the Void Nebula was like being inside a thunderstorm that never ended. Purple lightning hit his shields every few minutes and sent power surges through the ship's systems. Massive chunks of rock and ice appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. Jake had to fly by instinct more than instruments because his sensors could barely see a few kilometers ahead. The first Zephyrian outpost appeared on his scanners after 3 days of flying blind through the nightmare. It was a small mining station built into an asteroid that was rich in rare metals. Jake could see alien ships moving around the station, like insects around a nest. He counted 6 fighters and 2 larger vessels that looked like transports. Jake did not waste time trying to be clever about his attack. He flew straight at the station, with all weapons firing and his shields at maximum power. The Zephyrian fighters came at him in perfect formation, but they had never fought anything like. The second chance. Jake's ship was built like a battering ram and armed like a warship, but it moved like a fighter. The first alien fighter exploded when Jake's plasma cannons hit its engines. The second one tried to ram him, but Jake spun his ship out of the way and returned fire with missiles that tracked their target through 3 complete turns before finding their mark. The other fighters scattered and tried to use their superior speed to get behind him, but Jake had been flying combat missions before most of their pilots were born. When the last fighter was debris floating in space, Jake turned his attention to the mining station itself. The transport ships were trying to escape, but Jake's weapons had longer range than theirs. He destroyed both transports with concentrated fire, then started bombing the station until nothing was left but glowing metal and dead aliens. Jake searched through the wreckage for any sign of human prisoners, but found only mining equipment and alien bodies. The station's computer core had been destroyed in the attack, so there was no intelligence to recover. Jake marked the location on his charts and continued deeper into the nebula. The second outpost was different. It was a research station hidden inside a massive chunk of ice that had been hollowed out and fitted with docking bays. Jake's scanners detected human life signs inside the station, and his heart started beating faster. Danny could be in there. This time Jake tried to be more careful about his approach. He disabled the station's sensors with targeted strikes, then cut through the outer hull with his cutting beam. The station's defenders were ready for him, but they were not ready for a human who fought like he had nothing to lose. Jake moved through the alien corridors like death itself. His armor deflected their weapons, and his guns cut through their defenses like they were made of paper. The Zephyrians had superior technology, but they fought like soldiers following orders. Jake fought like a father trying to save his child. The research laboratories were in the center of the station, and what Jake found there made him understand why the aliens were taking human children. The Zephyrians were studying human brain development, and they were doing it by cutting open living subjects. Jake found 12 children in various stages of the alien experiments, and only 3 of them were still alive. Danny was not among them. Jake killed every alien in the station and set charges that would destroy the entire facility. He carried the 3 surviving children to his ship and tried not to look at what the aliens had done to them. One of the kids was a girl named Sophie, who had been on New Haven with Danny. She was barely conscious, but she managed to tell Jake that Danny had been taken to a bigger station deeper in the nebula. Jake left the research station as the expanding ball of fire and continued his hunt. Each facility he found was larger and more heavily defended than the last. Each attack made him better at killing Zephyrians and worse at being human. He stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time, and he ate only when his body forced him to. The aliens started to learn about him too. They set traps and ambush, but Jake had become something they could not predict or understand. He thought like an engineer when he needed to solve technical problems, but he fought like a wild animal when he was killing their people. The combination made him more dangerous than anything in their tactical databases. Jake's ship began to change as he stripped weapons and equipment from destroyed alien vessels. The second chance looked less like a human freighter and more like a hybrid monster built from the parts of a dozen different technologies. Jake's body was changing too, as he used alien medical devices to repair damage and enhance his capabilities. After 2 months in the nebula, Jake found the main research facility. It was a massive station built around a dying star that provided power for experiments that required enormous amounts of energy. Jake's scanners detected hundreds of human life signs inside the station, and his heart told him that Danny was among them. The station was protected by a fleet of warships that would have challenged a colonial battle group. Jake looked at the odds and did not care. He had become something that the old Jake Morrison would not have recognized and probably would have feared. The man who had played with his son in their backyard was gone, and in his place was a weapon powered by love and shaped by hatred. Jake started his final approach toward the alien station and activated every weapon system on his ship. The Zephyrians saw him coming and scrambled their fighters, but they had no idea what kind of monster they had created when they took his son. Jake Morrison had spent months learning how to be something worse than them, and now it was time for his graduation exam. The battle for the research station began with Jake's ship diving through the alien fleet like a missile aimed at the heart of their defenses. Explosions lit up the darkness around the dying star as the monster that used to be a father came home to collect what belonged to him. Jake's ship tore through the Zephyrian defense fleet like a bullet through glass. The alien warships tried to form a battle line, but Jake did not fight like their tactical computers expected. He flew straight through their formations and used their own ships as shields, while his weapons found weak points in their armor that should not have existed. The first battle cruiser exploded when Jake's modified plasma cannons overloaded its reactor core. The second one tried to ram him, but Jake had reinforced his ship's hull with alien metal that was harder than anything humans had ever created. The battle cruiser crumpled against the second chance like a tin can, while Jake's ship kept flying toward the research station. Fighter squadrons swarmed around him like angry insects, but Jake had learned to think like the aliens while keeping the unpredictability that made humans dangerous. He knew where they would be before they got there, and his weapons were waiting for them. Alien pilots who had trained for decades died in seconds because they could not understand how a single human could fight an entire fleet. The research station's defensive weapons opened fire as Jake approached the docking base. Energy beams that could vaporize asteroids hit his shields and made his ship shake like it was coming apart. Warning lights flashed across his control panels, and his computer told him that his shields would fail in minutes. Jake ignored the warnings and kept flying toward his target. Jake's ship smashed through the station's outer docking bay doors and skidded across the metal floor in a shower of sparks. Zephyrian soldiers were waiting for him with weapons ready, but Jake's ship was still armed, and he used his remaining missiles to clear the docking bay before he opened his airlock. The man who stepped out of the second chance was no longer recognizable as the engineer who had worked on colony ships. Jake's body had been enhanced with alien technology, and his armor was a combination of human and Zephyrian design that made him look like a walking weapon. His eyes showed no emotion, except the cold fury of someone who had spent months learning how to kill efficiently. The Zephyrian soldiers opened fire, but their weapons could not penetrate Jake's armor. He moved through their defensive positions like a force of nature, and his guns spoke in a language that every species in the galaxy understood. Death followed Jake through the station's corridors as he fought his way toward the research laboratories. High Researcher Zinix watched the humans advance on his security monitors and felt something his species rarely experienced: fear. The lone human had destroyed a fleet that should have been able to defeat a colonial battle group, and now he was cutting through the station's defenses like they were made of paper. Zinix ordered his guards to use the human children as shields, but somehow the attacking human seemed to know exactly where the children were and avoided those areas. Jake had studied the layout of Zephyrian research stations for months, and he knew how they thought. The most important experiments would be in the center of the station where they were most protected. The children would be kept in different areas, depending on what stage of experimentation they had reached. Jake had memorized every possible configuration, and his enhanced mind processed information faster than any human brain should have been able to. The first group of children Jake found were in holding cells near the station's edge. Most of them were unconscious from alien drugs, but a few were awake enough to recognize that someone was trying to help them. Jake broke open their cells and told them to stay hidden until he came back for them. He could see the fear in their eyes when they looked at him and realized that part of his mind understood why they were afraid. Jake continued deeper into the station and found more children in various stages of the alien experiments. Some had been changed by Zephyrian technology and would need months of medical treatment to recover. Others had been used in brain studies that left them damaged in ways that might never heal. Jake tried not to look too closely at what had been done to them because he needed to stay focused on his mission. The main laboratory was protected by the station's best guards and automated defense systems that could track and kill intruders with mechanical precision. Jake fought through them all with a combination of human tactics and alien weapons that created something entirely new. The Zephyrians had never faced anything like him because nothing like him had ever existed before. High Researcher Zinix was waiting in the laboratory's control room with Danny strapped to a medical table between them. The alien scientist held a weapon that could kill the boy instantly, and his yellow eyes showed the cold intelligence that made his species so dangerous. Zinix spoke in perfect human language and offered to trade the child for Jake's surrender. Jake looked at his son for the first time in months and felt his heart break and mend itself simultaneously. Danny was thinner than he remembered, and there were marks on his arms where alien medical devices had been attached. The boy's eyes were open, but they had the blank stare of someone who had seen too much horror to process. Jake set down his weapons and raised his hands as if he was surrendering. Zinix began to relax and started talking about the valuable research data he had collected from studying human brain development. The alien scientist explained how human children were perfect subjects because their minds were still growing and adapting to new experiences. While Zinix talked, Jake activated a small device hidden in his armor. The device had been built from Zephyrian technology, and it sent out an electromagnetic pulse that disabled every electronic system in the laboratory. The lights went out, and the medical equipment stopped working as emergency power tried to compensate. For the overload. In the darkness, Jake moved faster than any baseline human could have moved. His enhanced reflexes and alien night vision equipment let him cross the room before Zinix could react. Jake's hands closed around the alien's throat and lifted him off the ground while Danny watched from the medical table. Jake asked Zinix how it felt to be helpless while someone stronger decided whether he lived or died. The alien scientist tried to speak, but Jake's grip was too tight. Jake asked if Zinix had children of his own and whether he thought they would miss their father when he was gone. Zinix died slowly while Jake held him and looked into his yellow eyes. When it was over, Jake freed Danny from the medical table and carried him toward the laboratory exit. The boy did not speak or cry, but his small hands gripped Jake's armor with desperate strength. The research station was dying around them as Jake's sabotage devices destroyed critical systems throughout the facility. Emergency alarms were screaming, and Zephyrian voices could be heard calling for evacuation procedures. Jake retraced his path through the station and collected the other children he had found along the way. 18 children followed Jake back to his ship while the station tore itself apart behind them. Some of them could walk on their own, but others had to be carried by the stronger kids. Jake helped them all into his ship's passenger compartment and secured them as safely as possible for the journey back to human space as the second chance. Cleared the dying research station, Jake looked back at Danny, who was sitting quietly in the co-pilot chair. The boy had not spoken since Jake rescued him, and his eyes held a distance that had not been there before. Jake realized that the aliens had not been the only ones changed by what happened in the Void Nebula. The journey back to human space took 2 weeks, and Jake spent most of that time watching Danny sit quietly in the corner of the ship's main cabin. The boy ate when Jake put food in front of him, and slept when exhaustion finally took him, but he did not speak or play or show any interest in the other rescued children. Sometimes Jake caught Danny looking at him with an expression that made Jake's heart hurt in ways he had not expected. The other children were slowly starting to recover from their ordeal. A girl named Beth, who was 10 years old, had become the unofficial leader of the group, and she helped the younger ones understand that they were safe now. But even Beth seemed nervous around Jake, and the kids would stop talking when he entered the room. Jake realized that to them, he probably looked more like their alien captors than like someone who had come to rescue them. When the second chance finally reached colonial space, it was met by a fleet of military ships that had been waiting for Jake's return. Captain Lisa Chun contacted him on the communication system, and her voice was carefully neutral as she asked about the status of the rescued children. Jake could hear other voices in the background discussing whether his ship should be boarded by armed security teams. Jake docked his ship at Haven Station and watched through the windows as medical teams took the children away for treatment and evaluation. Danny was the last to leave, and he turned back to look at his father before the medical personnel led him through the airlock. The expression on the boy's face was one Jake had never seen before. It was the look of someone who was afraid of a person they used to love. The colonial investigators who questioned Jake were polite but thorough. They wanted to know everything about his time in the Void Nebula, and they were particularly interested in how he had managed to destroy so many Zephyrian facilities. Jake answered their questions honestly, but he could see that his methods troubled them. The way he described killing aliens without hesitation or remorse made the investigators uncomfortable. Dr. Patricia Wells was assigned to evaluate Jake's mental state and determine whether he posed a threat to civilian populations. She was a small woman with kind eyes who specialized in treating people who had experienced extreme trauma. Jake could tell that she was trying to help him, but he also knew that her report would determine whether he spent the rest of his life in prison or in a psychiatric facility. Dr. Wells asked Jake to describe how he felt about the violence he had committed against the Zephyrians. Jake tried to explain that he felt nothing at all when he killed them, because they had stopped being people to him and became obstacles between him and his son. The doctor wrote notes while he talked and occasionally asked follow-up questions that seemed designed to test his understanding of right and wrong. The children's medical reports painted a disturbing picture of what had happened to them in the alien research facilities. All of them showed signs of psychological trauma, and many had physical injuries from the experiments that had been performed on them. Danny's report was classified, but Jake was told that his son would need extensive therapy and might never fully recover from what he had experienced. Jake was allowed to visit Danny in the medical facility, but their meetings were supervised by doctors and social workers who watched every interaction. Danny would sit across from Jake at a small table and answer questions in a quiet voice that showed no emotion. When Jake asked if Danny was happy to be safe, the boy said yes, but his eyes suggested that he was not sure what safety meant anymore. The media attention around Jake's rescue mission was intense and divided. Some news programs called him a hero who had done what the colonial military could not do. Others described him as a dangerous vigilante who had violated interstellar law and committed acts of terrorism against an alien species. Jake did not watch the news reports. because he did not care what other people thought about his actions. What Jake did care about were the messages he started receiving from other parents whose children had been taken by aliens. They wanted to know how he had found the Zephyrian bases and what weapons he had used to destroy them. Some of the messages included offers to pay him to mount rescue missions for their own children. Jake deleted these messages without responding because he knew that what he had become was not something that should be copied. The Zephyrian Empire's response to the destruction of their research stations was swift and predictable. They declared Jake Morrison a war criminal and placed a bounty on his head that was large enough to buy a small planet. More importantly, they began mobilizing their military forces for what their leaders called a punitive expedition against human space. Captain Chun visited Jake in his holding cell and explained that the colonial government was in a difficult position. They could not officially approve of his methods, but they also could not deny that he had rescued 18 children who would have died in alien experiments. The decision had been made to release him on the condition that he remain on Haven Station under constant surveillance. Jake accepted the terms because he had nowhere else to go and nothing else he wanted to do. His old life was gone, and he could not build a new one while Danny was afraid of him. He spent his days in a small apartment, reading reports about Zephyrian military movements and watching news programs about the growing tensions between the two species. Other parents began arriving at Haven Station claiming they were there for medical treatment or business meetings, but Jake knew they had really come to see him. They would find ways to approach him in corridors or eating areas and ask quiet questions about how someone could fight aliens who were technologically superior to humans. Jake always told them to go home to their families and try to rebuild their lives, but he could see in their eyes that some of them were not listening. 3 months after his return, Jake was contacted by a man named Carl Brooks, whose daughter had been taken in the most recent Zephyrian raid. Brooks had sold everything he owned to buy weapons and ship modifications, and he wanted Jake's advice about mounting a rescue mission. Jake told him that the mission would be suicide and that his daughter was probably already dead, but Brooks said he had to try anyway. A week later, news reports confirmed that Brooks had attacked a Zephyrian patrol ship near the edge of the Void Nebula. His ship had been destroyed with all hands, but not before he had damaged the alien vessel enough to force it to retreat. The attack was being called the first act of organized human resistance against Zephyrian raids. Jake realized that something had started that could not be stopped. His example had shown other humans that the aliens could be hurt and that rescue missions were possible even if they were not likely to succeed. Parents who had lost children were learning from his methods and creating their own weapons and tactics. The colonial government was losing control of the situation as more and more humans decided that official channels were not enough, that the war that everyone had been afraid of was coming whether the governments wanted it or not, and Jake understood that he was responsible for making it inevitable. He had created something new when he transformed himself into a weapon capable of fighting aliens on their own terms. Now other humans were following his example and becoming monsters just like him. Jake looked out the window of his apartment at the stars beyond Haven Station and wondered if Danny would ever forgive him for what he had done and what he had become. Somewhere out there in the darkness, other fathers were making the same choices Jake had made and discovering the same truths about what humans could become when they stopped being civilized. 2 years had passed since Jake Morrison rescued his son from the Zephyrian research station, and the galaxy had changed in ways that nobody could have predicted. The Colonial Defense Force was fighting a war they had not wanted against an enemy. They did not understand, while human civilians formed underground resistance groups that operated beyond any government control. The groups called themselves different names, but the alien media had given them a single title that struck fear into non-human populations across known space: Morrison's children. They used Jake's tactics and his technology combinations to strike at alien targets throughout the frontier regions. Every attack was more brutal and more effective than the last, as humans learned to fight wars that ignored every rule of civilized conduct. Jake watched the news, reports from his apartment on Haven Station, and saw what his example had created. A woman named Karen Price had destroyed a Zephyrian mining operation using explosives built from their own equipment. A man called Tony Garcia had rescued 12 human prisoners from an alien slave market by killing everyone on the station and leaving no witnesses. Each success inspired more humans to follow their example. The Zephyrian Empire had declared total war on humanity, but their military leaders were discovering that humans under extreme stress became something their tactical computers could not predict or counter. Every human colony that was attacked produced more resistance fighters who learned from Jake's methods and improved upon them. The aliens had superior technology, but humans had something that could not be programmed into any computer system. Jake no longer received supervised visits with Danny because the boy had made it clear that he did not want to see his father. Dr. Wells had explained that Danny associated Jake with the violence and trauma he had experienced, and that forced contact would only make his recovery more difficult. Jake accepted this decision because he understood that his son was probably right to be afraid of what his father had become. The apartment Jake lived in had a small communication terminal that received messages from across human space. Most of the messages were from news organizations wanting interviews or from parents asking for advice about rescue missions. Jake deleted these without reading them because he had nothing to say that would help anyone. But one message was different from the others. The message came through an encrypted channel and the sender was identified only as a friend. Jake almost deleted it without opening it, but something about the way it was formatted reminded him of the communication codes he had learned during his military service. When he opened the message, it contained just 4 words written in a child's handwriting. "Come home when ready." Jake stared at the message for a long time before he understood what it meant. Danny was now 10 years old and old enough to understand what his father had done to save him. The boy was still afraid, but he was also starting to comprehend the price that had been paid for his freedom. Jake read the message 3 more times, then deleted it because he knew that the monster he had become could never return to the man Danny needed as a father. Reports from the frontier regions grew worse each week as the war between humans and aliens escalated beyond anything the colonial government could control. Morrison's children were operating in cells that had no central command and no unified strategy. They struck at targets of opportunity and used methods that would have been considered war crimes if they had been committed by an official military force. The Zephyrian response was equally brutal as they began executing human prisoners and bombing civilian targets in retaliation for resistance attacks. Other alien species were choosing sides in the conflict, and the whole frontier region was becoming a battlefield where no rules applied and no quarter was given. The war that had started with Jake's rescue mission was spreading across known space. Like a fire that could not be controlled. Jake received another message 6 months later, and this one was not encrypted. It came from Danny directly, and it contained a single question: "Are you still fighting for me?" Jake wrote back immediately and told his son that he had stopped fighting entirely and was trying to find a way to become human again. Danny's response came the next day, and it said that maybe they could try being human together. The meeting was arranged through Dr. Wells, and it took place in a small room at the medical facility where Danny was still receiving treatment. Father and son sat across from each other at the same table they had used for previous visits, but this time there were no supervisors watching them. Danny had requested privacy, and the doctors had decided he was ready for unsupervised contact with his father. Danny looked older than his 10 years, and his eyes held a sadness that no child should have to carry. But when he spoke, his voice was stronger than Jake remembered, and his words showed a maturity that came from experiencing things that most adults never had to face. Danny told his father that he understood why Jake had done what he did, and that he was grateful to be alive, even though the cost had been terrible. Jake tried to apologize for becoming someone that Danny was afraid of, but the boy interrupted him and said that fear was not the same as hatred. Danny explained that he was afraid of many things now, including loud noises and closed spaces and people who looked like aliens. But he was not afraid of his father, because he knew that Jake would never hurt him intentionally. They talked for 2 hours about things they had never discussed before. Danny described what he remembered about the alien research station and the experiments that had been performed on him and the other children. Jake told Danny about the months he had spent in the Void Nebula and the things he had done to find the alien bases. Neither of them tried to minimize the horror of what they had experienced. When the visit ended, Danny hugged his father for the first time since the rescue and asked if Jake would come back next week. Jake promised that he would, and for the first time in 2 years, he felt something other than emptiness when he thought about the future. Maybe the monster could find a way to become a father again, even if he could never become the man he had been before. The war in the frontier regions continued to escalate as more human resistance groups adopted Jake's methods and created new tactics for fighting technologically superior enemies. The galaxy was learning that humans were capable of becoming something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined when they were pushed beyond their breaking point. The aliens had taken Jake's son and created a monster in return, but that monster had shown other humans what they could become. Jake Morrison spent his days in quiet conversations with his son and his knights, reading reports about battles being fought by people who called themselves his children. He had started something that could never be stopped and created a new kind of warfare that would change the balance of power in the galaxy. But for the first time since Danny had been taken, Jake was more interested in learning how to be a father than how to be a weapon. Somewhere in the darkness between the stars, other monsters were hunting aliens who had made the mistake of taking something that belonged to humanity. They would fight until every human child was free, or until there were no more monsters left to do the fighting. Jake had shown them the way, and now they were following it to whatever end awaited them in the cold emptiness of space, where the only law was the one written in blood and maintained by those who loved enough to become something terrible.